Have you ever loved someone you knew you couldn't have? I'm not talking about a fleeting passion, the kind that fades over time. I'm talking about a love that sweeps through you in a way that changes everything. The way you look, the way you breathe, the way you see yourself in the mirror. The kind of love that blossoms in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet seems the most right thing in the world. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I fell in love with my sister's husband, and the hardest thing to admit is that he fell in love with me too. For a long time I thought it was just imagination, an illusion created by loneliness, or perhaps a desire disguised as admiration. But time has a cruel way of revealing truths. It brings you face to face with what you tried hardest to hide. And the truth is, I never wanted to feel what I felt. I fought it. I tried to deny it. I tried to run away. I tried to believe it was just a mistake. But how do you fight something that makes you feel alive after so many years of silence? The story begins a long time ago, at a time in my life when I already considered myself a calm man, someone who had learned to accept what fate had dealt. My sister had been married for years, had children and a stable life. He, my brother-in-law, had always been the kind of man everyone admired, hard-working, reserved, kind. And me? I simply watched him from afar, as if trying to decipher a mystery that shouldn't exist. At first, it was just respect, then admiration, until one day it became something I could no longer name. And the worst part was that his eyes seemed to say the same thing, even when the silence tried to muffle it. Because there are things the body speaks even when the mouth is silent. And between us, the silence spoke volumes. I remember the first time I realized something had changed. It was at a family dinner. The house was full, voices mingled, children running around. I went to the kitchen to get more wine and he was there alone, leaning against the counter. Our eyes met for a few seconds, and in those seconds everything we'd never said took shape. He smiled, but it wasn't just any smile. It was the kind of smile that carries a secret, a recognition. I felt the ground disappear for a moment. I returned to the table, but in that moment I knew something inside me had awakened. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was reading too much into nothing. But small gestures began to betray me. The way he looked at me when he thought no one was looking, the conversations that went on too long about simple matters, the touch that was too quick to be accidental. The tension began to build, silent, dangerous. And the more I tried to avoid it, the more fate seemed to create situations that would put us in the same space. I didn't know when I lost control. I only know that one night after a family dinner, he stayed to help clean the kitchen. My sister had gone upstairs to put the kids to bed. We were alone. The conversation started off light, but his gaze was different. It wasn't that of a brother-in-law nor a friend. It was that of someone struggling with the same abyss as me. And in that moment, I understood. He felt the same way. Nothing happened that night. No touch, no words beyond the necessary, but the air was thick with everything we hadn't said. And when he left, I realized something had changed forever. Because what's said can be forgotten, but what's felt, that remains. The following weeks were torment. I avoided going to my sister's house, made excuses, tried to fill my time with anything. But fate is stubborn. And one day, he showed up at my door. He said he was passing by and wanted to see me. I knew it wasn't true, but I let him in anyway. The conversation began with banalities, but the silences spoke louder than words. He looked at me and said something that resonates to this day. There are things we can't choose. I didn't answer. Because what could I say? That I was stuck in the same knot, that I thought about him every night, even though I knew how wrong it was. There was no right answer. So we just stood there looking at each other like two guilty people who didn't know whether to apologize or ask for permission. This is the part of the story that many people wouldn't understand. Because for those who have never experienced something like this, it's easy to judge. But anyone who has loved someone forbidden knows, love, when it comes, doesn't ask permission. For it crosses, destroys, confuses, and yet it gives meaning. It's the most human paradox there is. I'm not telling this to justify anything. I'm telling it because after so many years, I've learned that hiding the truth doesn't erase what it was. And because perhaps someone out there watching now is experiencing the same dilemma, caught between what's right and what their heart insists on calling true. If you've ever been torn between what you should feel and what you actually feel, you'll understand what I'm talking about. The look that lingers longer than is acceptable, the touch that lingers on your skin for days, the memory that insists on returning when you try hardest to forget it. And that's why, even after so many years, this story still haunts me. Not because I want to relive it, but because it showed me who I really was. The man behind the appearances, the conventions, the fear. But what happened after that night, when he knocked on my door alone, and was what really changed everything. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something, and it's more important than it seems. If you felt something up until now, if this story made you think about something from your past, about someone who marked your life, or even about a secret that time never took away, leave your like now. This helps the channel grow and shows that stories like this still have room to be told. Stories about feelings, courage, choices, and truths that we hide for fear of judgment. And I want to ask you something else. Comment below what you felt so far. It could be a word, a memory, or just an "I understand." Because sometimes, what you write in the comments doesn't just help me. It helps others who are going through something similar, but don't have the courage to speak up. That's the power of sharing. And if you are not yet registered, sign up now. Here I tell stories about real life, the ones you don't see in photos, but that stay in your heart. Stories of love, regret, forgiveness, and new beginnings. All with the truth of someone who's lived long enough to know that time changes everything, except what we truly feel. So subscribe, activate the bell, and stay with me until the end, because what comes next is where this story starts to become impossible to forget. He stood before me, and for a moment I thought time had frozen. The same man who, until recently, had been a part of Sunday dinners, family conversations, and table laughter, now stood there alone in front of me with a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. There was a weight on his shoulders, a kind of weariness that came not from the body, but from the soul. He took a deep breath, hesitated for a few seconds, and then said, "We need to talk." I let him in. The silence felt like an extra guest. I sat on the couch and watched him pace the room, looking around as if searching for something to say. "She went to her mother's house for a few days," he began, not looking at me. "The kids stayed with her. I just needed some time to think." That sentence, so simple, carried a silent confession. He wasn't there by chance. He was there because something inside him had also collapsed. I wanted to ask why, I wanted to understand what brought him there, but I didn't need to. His look said it all. He sat in the chair across from me. His elbows were resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I shouldn't be here," he said, but at the same time, I couldn't stay away. My heart raced. I knew what he meant, but hearing it out loud was like crossing a line that until then had existed only in my imagination. I tried to maintain control, to hide the tremor in my voice. "Why did you come?" I asked. He looked up and answered with a disarming sincerity, "Because I don't know how to lie anymore." There was a long silence, the kind that carries the weight of everything that was never said. I looked at him and tried to find the man I knew, my sister's husband, the father of my nephews, the upstanding, centered, respected man. But what I saw was another man, one who trembled, who seemed suffocated, who struggled with his own reflection. He began to speak slowly, as if choosing each word for fear of hurting someone. He said he hadn't slept well in weeks, that his head wouldn't stop. He said that every time he saw me, something inside him shifted, as if the world was spinning. "I tried to avoid it," he confessed. "God knows I tried, but when I'm around you, I forget everything else. I forget what I should, what I can, what I can't." That confession cut me to the quick. I should have told him to leave. I should have told him it was crazy, that there was no going back after those words. But I didn't, because deep down, I felt the same way. And hearing it out loud was like someone had finally translated what I'd been carrying inside me for months. He ran his hands over his face and continued, not daring to look me in the eye. I love your sister, you know that. But it's different. I've gotten used to her. It's like a routine that sticks to itself. With you, it's something else. It's like I've woken up after years of sleep. His words echoed, painful and sweet at the same time, and I realized there was nothing I could say to change it. The feeling was already there. The mistake, if it was a mistake, was already made in my heart, even if nothing had happened. The tension in the air was almost physical. I could hear the sound of his breathing, smell his perfume mixed with fear. There was something dangerous and inevitable about that moment. He stood slowly, took a few steps to the window and stared out at the street. "Do you think this is wrong?" he asked. It took me a while to respond. "I think the wrong thing to do is keep pretending we don't feel anything." He looked at me with an expression that mixed relief and guilt. He took a step toward me, then another, and stopped. We stood face to face, so close I could hear his heartbeat. Time seemed to dissolve. Right and wrong ceased to exist for a few seconds, and in that instant, without needing words, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. He took a step back, took a deep breath, and said, "I have to go." His voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "If I stay another minute, I won't make it." I just nodded. I watched him leave, close the door slowly, and the sound of that click seemed to close one part of my life and open another. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I returned to my routine, to work, to my usual conversations. But something was different. The silence, which had previously been just absence, now held a weight. Every time the phone rang, my heart raced. Every time I saw his car passing by on the street, I felt my body react as if caught between fear and desire. One afternoon, I ran into my sister at the bakery. She was talking about her usual life, the kids, work, bills, and I found myself looking at her with a kind of compassion I'd never felt before. Because for the first time, I realized she too was living an illusion. That, deep down, she too felt his distance, but pretended not to see it. And that hurt me. Because love, when forbidden, doesn't just destroy the one who feels it. It destroys those around them too. That night, the phone rang. It was him. His voice was different, tired but determined. "I need to see you," he said. And it was there, in that simple sentence, that I understood that destiny had decided to continue what it started. If you got this far, comment the word "prohibited" down here. I want to see who understands what it's like to live divided between what is right and what the heart insists on calling truth. And if you haven't liked it yet, do it now, because that's how I know you want to hear what happened when he came back that night and knocked on my door again. He knocked on my door on a rainy night. There was no message beforehand, no warning, no apology. Just the sound of his knuckles knocking twice, briefly, as if afraid of being heard. When I opened it, the cold wind rushed in with him. His coat was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his lost gaze, that same look that had haunted me for months. I said nothing. I just stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the middle of the room, motionless, breathing deeply, as if trying to compose himself. I could see a slight tremor in his hands. For a moment, the sound of rain hitting the windows was the only thing that existed. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I tried. I swear I tried. But each day that passed seemed worse. I thought time would erase this, but it doesn't. Those words pierced me. I wanted to respond, but my body wouldn't obey. There was something different about him, a mix of guilt and relief, as if he'd finally stopped pretending. I approached slowly, trying to understand what he wanted, what he expected of me. He looked away, ran a hand through his wet hair, and said, "I shouldn't be here, but this is where I feel whole." The weight of that sentence filled the air. It was as if everything we'd lived in silence had finally found a voice. I sat down on the couch and he did the same, leaving a calculated distance between us. We talked about everything and nothing, work, life, trivial things, but every pause was a minefield. The tension was there, alive, pulsing. I could feel my heart pounding, as if my entire body were on alert. At one point he fell silent. He looked at me with a look I've never forgotten, a look that simultaneously asked permission and confessed. "I didn't come here to talk about work," he said. "I came because I can't pretend anymore." He leaned forward, hands clasped, his gaze steady. "I know this is wrong. I know what people would say, but what I feel doesn't go away just because the world doesn't accept it." His voice trembled, but it held conviction. "I spend my days trying to be what they expect of me, and every night I wonder when I stopped being me." That sentence broke me, because I knew exactly what he meant. I'd spent years doing the same thing, playing roles, smiling out of politeness, hiding out of fear, and hearing that from someone I'd never imagined seeing, stripped of masks, hit me in a way no previous confession had. "Do you think there's forgiveness for this?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. It took me a while to answer. The clock read just past 9, but time seemed suspended. "I don't know if what we feel requires forgiveness," I said. "Maybe just courage." He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and when he opened them, there were tears still in them. I'd never seen him cry before. He was a strong-looking man, the kind who learned early on that men don't weaken, don't get emotional, don't expose themselves. But there, before me, he was only human. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said. "Not you, not her. But every time I try to be the right man, I feel empty." He stood up and began pacing as if trying to escape himself. With each step, the ground creaked, accompanying the sound of the rain outside. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked, stopping suddenly. "Do you understand what it's like to look at someone and know you should hate them, but all you can do is love?" I understood. I understood every word, every pause, every breath. Because it was the same conflict that had consumed me since the first glance. He stepped closer. The silence between us was almost a touch, and then, for the first time, he reached out his hand. I didn't think. I just took it. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried a lifetime of denial. No words were enough. The touch said it all. For a few seconds we stood there, trapped in a time that seemed to belong to no one. The sound of the rain grew distant. The world disappeared. And in that instant I realized that what we had allowed to grow within us wasn't just desire. It was recognition. But then he released my hand, like someone waking from a dream they know can't continue. "I can't do this to her," he murmured, his voice cracking. "To your sister, she doesn't deserve it." I just nodded. Neither of us knew what to do. Love, when born from the impossible, is a prison. He got up, walked to the door, and paused before leaving. He turned and said, "One day when this is all over, maybe we can forgive each other." And then he left. The next few days were long, the hours seemed slower, and the house felt bigger. Every corner held an echo of his voice. I tried to stick to my routine, but nothing felt normal. The food tasted tasteless, the work felt meaningless. It was as if half of me had remained in that room. One Sunday afternoon, my sister called me. She said he was distant, distracted, and quiet. She asked if I knew anything. I said no. Lying sometimes is the only way to protect someone, even when the lie also destroys you. After the call, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how cruel life is in its ironies. We spend years trying to do the right thing, but it's what's true that comes to haunt us. And I understood then that love, no matter how pure, can be born within a moral maze impossible to navigate without getting hurt. Time passed, weeks, maybe months. The family conversations continued, but he avoided looking at me. His presence, even in silence, was a constant reminder. I feigned naturalness, but his every gesture struck me as a reminder of what could have been. One night after dinner, he approached. The family had already gone to bed. I was leaving to get my coat when I heard his voice behind me. "We need to stop pretending it didn't happen." I turned. His gaze was steady, but his face was exhausted. "Do you think you can forget?" he asked. "No," I said. "But you can try to live despite it." He was silent for a moment, then smiled. A brief, sad smile. "You were always stronger than me." I laughed, but without humor. "No, I just learned to hide it better." And he nodded, as if he understood. When he left that night, I knew it wouldn't be the end. Because some encounters don't just disappear. They stay there, hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. If you're watching this far, comment the word courage, because only those who have experienced an impossible love understand the weight and strength of loving in silence. And if this story has touched you in any way, leave a like, because what comes next will show what happens when what we feel refuses to die, even when everything around us demands it die. The months that followed that last encounter were a mixture of relief and torture. The distance seemed necessary, but it was also unbearable. I tried to convince myself it was the best for everyone, for him, for my sister, for me. But the truth is, nothing fit anymore. The silence between us was too heavy to be forgotten, and every casual gesture at family gatherings became a minefield of memories. He would arrive, greet with a quick handshake, avoid my gaze, and yet it only took a second of carelessness for it all to come flooding back. The touch, the smell, the memory of what we never had the courage to experience. My sister seemed to notice nothing. Perhaps because her love for him was blind, or perhaps because deep down she already knew and preferred not to see. Their routine remained intact: dinners, forced laughter, the appearance of a happy marriage, and every time I saw them together, I felt something break a little more inside me. Guilt and desire coexisted like two enemies that could not be destroyed. There was one day, however, that changed the course of everything. It was a late Sunday afternoon. I was at home reading when I heard the sound of his car pulling up in front. For a second, I thought it was a coincidence, but the sound of the doorbell dispelled any doubt. When I opened the door, he was there again, not drenched in rain like last time, but with the same tired look. "Can I come in?" he asked, and I just stepped aside. He sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and was silent for a moment. Then he said bluntly, "She cheated on me." I froze. "I found out a week ago. I didn't want to believe it, but it's true." His voice was cold, but his eyes betrayed a broken man. We were silent for a moment. The air seemed thicker. He continued, "Funny, isn't it? We spend our lives trying to be what the world expects, and in the end, we discover that no one is what they seem. Not me, not her." He laughed, but without joy. Maybe this is fate, or maybe just the price of lying. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt pity, part felt anger, and another part, the most human of all, felt guilty relief. It was as if the universe were opening a dangerous gap, a space where the impossible began to seem possible. He stood there for hours, saying little, staring into space. Sometimes our eyes would meet and we would be trapped in that charged silence. Until he said something I've never forgotten. "When she cheated on me, the only thing I could think about was you." That sentence pierced me like a confession and a wound at the same time. "Why?" I asked, almost speechless. He replied, "Because I realized it wasn't anger I felt, it was lack, a lack of something real. And the only moment in my life when I felt whole was with you." The room seemed to shrink. The clock's sound grew louder, the air thicker. He approached slowly and I didn't move. It wasn't impulse nor weakness, it was inevitable. When our faces were close enough, he whispered, "I'm done running." And he kissed me. It was a restrained kiss, full of fear and desire at the same time, like someone who fears and yet surrenders. A kiss from someone who has spent a lifetime denying the obvious. When he pulled away, his eyes were teary. "This changes everything," he said. I replied, "No, this only reveals what was already there." That moment was brief, but intense enough to become an everlasting memory. He stayed a while longer, and we spoke little, simply letting the silence do what words couldn't. Before leaving, he held my hand and said, "I don't know what will become of me after this, but for the first time, I feel alive." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, reliving every second, every gesture, every word. My mind told me it was madness, that none of this could work. But my heart just knew how to beat. Over the next few days, he sent me short, discreet messages. "I thought about you. I can't forget. I wanted to see you." I responded with the same caution, until one day he wrote, "I don't want to lie anymore." And that's when the fear returned. Because love is easy to feel, but expensive to sustain. The idea that he might abandon everything, his marriage, his image, his family, scared me more than anything. I knew that if he took that step, there would be no going back. And deep down, I didn't know if I wanted to carry that weight. We met again a few days later. It was night in a secluded park. He was different, lighter but also determined. "I filed for divorce," he said bluntly. I remained silent. She accepted. She said she expected it, that somehow she knew I wasn't here anymore. We sat on a bench side by side watching the city lights in the distance. "What now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Now I want to live. And if that means living with you, I'll take it." That took me by surprise. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a sincere, mature, painful surrender. A broken man saying that, even in pieces, he still wanted to try. But life isn't just about intentions. I knew that behind that gesture lay the weight of consequences. My sister, my children, my family, no one would understand. We would be the villains in a story that began with love, but that the world would call sin. And it was there, sitting beside him, that I realized something. Love isn't the problem. Fear is. The fear of being judged, the fear of losing yourself, the fear of letting yourself go. And maybe that's exactly what love is, choosing to feel, even when the whole world tells you not to. That night he hugged me before he left. A long, silent hug, the kind that says what words never can. When he pulled away, he looked me in the eyes and said, "If it's going to fail, at least let it be because you tried." I stood there, watching him drive away, until the car's lights disappeared around the corner. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. If you got this far, comment the word true. Because that's what this story carries, the truth that many hide, but few have the courage to admit. And leave a like now, because what comes next is where love and guilt finally meet. And nothing, absolutely nothing, remains the same after that. In the days that followed, routine became a battleground between reason and desire. I tried to move on, feigning normalcy, but every message from him, every memory of that kiss came like a spark in the darkness. It was as if, after years of living on autopilot, I had rediscovered what it meant to truly feel, and it frightened me. Loving a married man was already a wound. Loving my sister's husband, it was almost a sin. But what do you do when your heart refuses to obey your judgment? He always sought me out at unlikely times, like someone who doesn't want to be seen. A quick phone call, a disguised encounter, a touch disguised as chance. And even in those fragments of time, the world seemed to stand still. We looked at each other as if we knew we were treading on forbidden ground, but also as if we understood that in that moment, it was impossible to back out. Love, when it comes late, is more intense because it carries the weight of what could have been and the urgency of someone who no longer has much time to wait. My sister, unbeknownst to me, began to notice his distance. Dinners became fewer, conversations became shorter, laughter more forced. One day she commented to me, "He's acting strange, distracted. He doesn't look at me like he used to." I swallowed hard and replied what any coward would. It must be work. But deep down I knew the truth, and what ate away at me wasn't the fear of being discovered, it was the fear of seeing everything fall apart. Not just their marriage, but the little dignity I had left. He felt the weight too. One day he wrote to me, "I think our love is hurting a lot of people." I read that sentence several times before responding, because he was right. What we were going through was intense, but it was also an open wound. Still, I wrote back, "It hurts, yes, but it's the only thing that still makes me feel alive." He didn't respond, and I understood his silence as a mirror of my own, the kind of silence that carries guilt and desire in equal measure. A few weeks later, he showed up at my door again, but this time his eyes were different. He looked tired, dull. "She found out," were the first words out of his mouth. I felt the ground disappear. "What do you mean?" He ran his hands over his face and replied, "A message, an oversight. She saw." My heart raced. "And what did she say?" He laughed humorlessly. "Nothing. She just cried, and since then, she hasn't looked at me." I was speechless. Part of me wanted to hug him, another wanted to scream. because in that moment I realized that the love we'd shared, however sincere, was fraught with destruction. He continued, "She's leaving. She said she's going to her mother's house with the kids." And he remained silent, staring at the ground, like a man who, for the first time, realized the extent of his own ruin. I walked over, touched his shoulder, and said, "You knew this could happen." He looked up, a mixture of anger and tenderness there. "I knew, but I thought love justified everything." I replied, "Love never justifies the damage it leaves behind, but sometimes it's the only thing that makes us understand who we are." He stood there for a while, saying nothing. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you think we made a mistake?" I hesitated, then replied, "I think we felt it. And feeling, however wrong it may seem, is never the real mistake." He nodded slowly, and in that gesture there was both regret and relief. In the following days, things got worse. My sister called me a few times, crying, saying she didn't know what to do. I listened silently, trying to comfort her, but every word felt like a stab. Because deep down, I was part of the reason for that pain. She said, "He didn't just betray me with his body, he betrayed me with his soul. You can feel it when someone's no longer here." I wanted to tell her she was right, but how could I admit it without destroying what little remained of our family? The news spread quickly, the small town, the tight social circle. It didn't take long for looks to change, for conversations to die down whenever I entered a room. No one said anything openly, but judgment was everywhere. It was as if people took pleasure in pointing fingers, knowing nothing but rumors. He in turn withdrew from everything. He requested a job transfer, sold his car, and avoided going out. One day I found him sitting alone on a park bench. The wind blew and leaves fell around him, as if time were trying to cover the wounds the world had opened. He saw me, smiled slightly, and said, "It seems everyone knows now." I sat beside him in silence. He continued, "It's strange. I thought that when the truth came out I would feel free. But all I feel is fear." "Afraid of what?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "That in the end, we won't have the courage to live through what we started." And that sentence stuck inside me like a seed. Because love, when it's true, isn't measured by what we feel. It's measured by what we're willing to face. We stood there for a long time without saying anything else. Sometimes silence is the only way to talk when the whole world seems too loud. He looked at me one last time and said, "I have to go." And he left. I watched him walk away, knowing that might be the last time I'd see him. But deep down I knew. Stories like these never truly end. They just change shape. In the days that followed, I tried to live with his absence. The phone was silent, the routine was cold, the house was empty. The pain was real, but there was also a strange sense of relief. As if, after all this, there was finally room to breathe. I knew love could be beautiful, but no one tells you how devastating it can be when it's born in the wrong place. Still, there was something that wouldn't die. Even with the guilt, even with the weight, there was still the memory. Because the body forgets, but the look, that look that once met mine in the kitchen at that family dinner, that remains. And perhaps that was what time wanted to teach me, that love, even when it can't be lived, is still worth having existed. If you got this far, comment the word courage. Because that's what this story is about, the courage to feel, to face fear, to acknowledge one's own truth, even when it hurts. And if this story touched you in any way, leave your like now. This shows that you understand the power of a love that, even though impossible, can still change everything. The following weeks were a void difficult to explain. The routine continued, but nothing had color anymore. The days passed slowly, repetitively, as if I were merely watching my own life from the outside. The silence inside the house seemed to echo off the walls. The phone, which had once brought expectation, was now a constant reminder of his absence. And the worst part was that, even as I tried to move on, everything reminded me of him. His coffee in the morning, the smell of the rain, even the way the afternoon light streamed through the window. It's curious how the body retains what the mind tries to erase. One day, I ran into my sister at the market. She looked thinner, tired, but still with that steady gaze she always had. She saw me from afar and hesitated for a moment. I thought she was going to turn away, but she came right up to me. My heart raced. I didn't know what to say, and neither did she. We stood there for a few seconds, awkward, until she broke the silence. "He left." The words felt like a blow. "Where?" I asked. She shrugged. "He said he needed time, that he was going to his mother's house for a few days." His mother's name, the house where we'd spent so many Christmases, came with memories that hurt like a blade. "And you?" I asked. She took a deep breath and replied, "I'm trying to understand what's left." And then there was a long, heavy pause. She looked at me with a look that seemed to pierce through. "You know what's worse?" she said. "It wasn't the betrayal. It was the silence, the feeling that I'd been sleeping next to a stranger for years. And that's when I realized the love that destroys isn't the one that explodes, it's the one that slowly dies." I left with a lump in my throat. Her pain mirrored mine too. We had both lost something. She, her husband. I, the man I could never truly have. The difference was that she could grieve out loud. I couldn't. My pain was secret, hidden between regret and desire. And perhaps what hurt most was this: knowing that love, when lived in the dark, never finds space to heal in the light of day. The days passed and guilt began to mix with longing. I tried to rationalize everything, tell myself it had to end, that it was right. But the nights don't obey reason. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with his name on the tip of my tongue. Other times I'd dream of the touch of his hands, the smell of his skin, and wake up confused, caught between pleasure and guilt. There are feelings we try to bury, but they know how to dig themselves back to the surface. A month later, he showed up again. He knocked on my door as if nothing had happened. The same tired look, the same low voice, but something about him had changed. "I needed to see you," he said, not to relive anything, but to try to understand what was left. I remained silent, watching this man who somehow still belonged to me. He came in, sat on the couch, and the familiar scent of his cologne filled the air, bringing back everything I'd tried to forget. We chatted for a while about trivial things, work, the city, the kids, but behind every word was the weight of what couldn't be said. At one point, he looked at me and said, "I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I tried to build has turned to dust. And the worst part is, I don't know if I deserve to start over." I took a deep breath and replied, "We can always start over. It's just that sometimes the new beginning isn't the way we dream." He lowered his gaze, and the silence that followed felt like a scream. I could tell he was broken. The once confident man was now a shadow. "Does my sister hate you?" I asked. He hesitated and replied, "No, I think she just feels sorry for you. And that somehow is worse." I thought about it for a while. Pity is the cruelest feeling anyone can evoke, because there's no going back. In the days that followed, we began talking again, but in a different way. No plans, no hidden meetings, no promises. It was as if time had drained away our desire and left only the truth, that in the end what united us was not just love, but loneliness. Because there's a time in life when what hurts most isn't what we've lost, but what's left unsaid. One night he sent me a long message. He said he was coming back to town, but not to get back together with her. He said he wanted to reconnect with his son, to try to be a better father. "I'm tired of running away," he wrote. "I've spent my life trying to appear strong. Now I just want to be someone at peace." I read those words and felt a strange relief, as if for the first time, what we'd been through was serving a purpose. A few days later, we met again, this time without secrets. He seemed calmer, almost serene. He talked about his son, about his fear of growing old alone, about his regret at having spent his entire life trying to please others. "You know what's worse," he said. "I spent 40 years trying to be the man the world expected, but I was never the man I wanted to be." Those words stuck with me, because deep down we all do it. We spend our lives trying to fit into molds, meet expectations, avoid judgment. And when time takes its toll, we discover that what we left behind weren't opportunities. They were whole versions of who we could have been. As he spoke, I realized how much time changes us and at the same time reveals us. He was no longer the man who made me tremble at first sight. He was someone tired, but more genuine. And for the first time, I saw myself differently too. I no longer needed that love to feel alive. I just needed to understand what he represented. When he left that night, there was no kiss, no promise, no tears. Just a long, firm, silent handshake, like that of two men who finally understand each other without words. But in that farewell there was something more. A look of gratitude, of respect, perhaps even of love, but a mature, serene love without the haste and desperation of years gone by. A love that understands that not every story needs a happy ending to last forever. In the following days, I felt lighter again. I slept better, breathed better. The guilt seemed to have turned to understanding. And when I looked in the mirror for the first time in years, I saw a man at peace. A man who had lived, made mistakes, loved, and survived it all. If you got this far, comment the word understanding, because that's the word that defines what comes after pain. The understanding that love, even when impossible, can be a silent master. And if this story made you think of someone, leave your like. I want to know if you also believe that sometimes the truest love is the one that teaches you to let go. The months that followed that goodbye were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The house seemed bigger, time seemed slower, and for the first time, silence didn't scare me. It was a mature silence, the kind that doesn't demand answers. Life somehow had settled down in a lighter way. The old pain no longer tightened my chest, and love, that forbidden, confusing, guilt-ridden love, had become something calmer, like a memory that no longer hurts. Still, sometimes I missed it. Not his presence per se, but the intensity that only exists when we experience something the world doesn't understand. Because as much as it hurts, loving someone like that awakens you in a way nothing else can. One morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. One of those premonitions that you don't know where it comes from, but you sense something is about to change. I went to the balcony, made coffee, and watched the empty street. The sky was gray, and there was something in the air that reminded me of the past. I picked up the newspaper, but I couldn't read it. My thoughts kept returning to him, to what might have been, to what was left, to what time had made of each of us. It had been almost a year since I'd last seen him, and even without contact, there was a silent presence that still accompanied me. Then the phone rang. The ringing, which for a long time had only brought inconsequential calls, this time sent a chill down my spine. I answered, and on the other end a familiar but different voice, huskier, slower. It was him. He said my name calmly, yet emotionally charged. "I need to see you," he said. The sentence was simple, but the tone, that tone only exists when the soul is weary. I asked if everything was okay. He hesitated, took a deep breath, and replied, "Almost." We met in the same park where years ago we had talked in secret while the children played, the same place where time seemed suspended. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a wooden bench. He was thinner, his hair gray, his gaze distant. He looked like a man who had lived longer than his body could tell. When I approached, he smiled, a faint smile, but genuine. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said. "I thought you wouldn't look for me anymore," I replied. He laughed, that brief, melancholy laugh of someone who knows life is made of missed encounters. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the sound of the wind through the trees. And then he said, "I needed time to understand what I did with my life and yours." I said nothing. Sometimes words only get in the way. He continued, "My sister forgave me. She said that deep down she'd known something was wrong for a long time, but her forgiveness didn't bring me peace. What I needed was yours." That sentence hung in the air. I felt its impact as if time had stopped again. He lowered his head, his eyes welling with tears, and added, "I've spent my whole life trying to be the right man, and in the end, I realized I was just a coward." The sincerity in his voice disarmed me. It was hard to hear it without remembering the cost, the suffering, the shame, the emptiness that remained between us. But there was also something beautiful there. An older man, finally able to face his own reflection without disguise. I told him that I had changed too, that I learned to live without depending on anyone's presence to feel whole. I told him that love, over time, had stopped being a wound and became a good memory, the kind of memory we carry fondly without resentment. He listened to me in silence, nodding slowly, as if finally understanding what had previously seemed impossible. We talked for hours, but not about what we were, but about what we'd become. He told me he'd quit his job, that he no longer wanted to pretend to anyone. He said his oldest son was married and that his granddaughter was the joy of the house. He spoke of her with a sparkle in his eyes I'd never seen before. "She makes me feel like there's still time to be someone better," he said. I smiled. "There's always time," I replied. As the sun began to set, he pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden box. He opened it, and inside was an old photo. The two of us, young, smiling at a family barbecue. My sister was in the background, holding a glass. That image hit me like an arrow, not with guilt, but with the memory of a time when it was still possible to believe that life could be simple. He looked at the photo and said, "I've kept this for all these years. It's the only thing I could never bring myself to throw away." The wind blew cold, but our hearts were warm. We stared at the photo in silence, as if it were proof that despite everything, love had existed, and somehow it still existed, transformed, matured, silent. He put the photo back and looked me in the eyes. If I could go back in time, I would have done everything differently. I took a deep breath and replied, "If we went back, we would have made the same mistakes, only more consciously." He laughed, and so did I. Sometimes humor is the only way to endure what cannot be changed. As the sun set, he stood, straightened his coat, and said, "I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I wanted to thank you for not hating me." I shook my head. "I never hated you. I just needed time to understand you." He held out his hand, and when I took it, I realized there was no more anger, no more desire, no more hurt, only an immense affection, the kind that arises when love finds maturity. When he left, I stood there for a while, gazing at the horizon. The park was beginning to empty, and the sky took on that orange hue that seems to embrace the soul. I thought about everything we've lived through, everything we've lost, and most importantly, everything we've learned. Some loves aren't meant to last, they're meant to teach. And what he taught me was not to be afraid to feel, even when it hurts. In the days that followed, I felt a lightness I'd never known. It was as if that encounter had healed an old wound. I began writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote about love, forgiveness, time, about how life is made of twists and turns and how sometimes healing comes disguised as reunion. One afternoon I sat on the porch, watching the sky fade into the sunset, and thought about everything we've been. And I realized that perhaps the greatest beauty of life lies precisely in this, in imperfection, in the fact that we make mistakes, lose ourselves, blame ourselves, but we keep going. And sometimes keeping going is already an act of courage. If you're listening to me this far, comment on the word heal, because in the end, that's what this story represents, the power to heal from guilt, from wounds, from impossible loves. And leave your like too, so I know this story touched you in some way. I want to see how many of you still believe that forgiveness is, deep down, the most mature form of love. The years passed like a weight lifted from our shoulders, leaving only the essentials. After everything that happened, I learned to live in peace with what was left. Life no longer had the same fast pace or expectations as before. It was simpler, quieter, but in a good way. Waking up early, tending to the plants, walking around the neighborhood, observing the movements of people who still seemed to be rushing about without knowing where they were going, all of this became a kind of therapy. As we grow older, we learn that living well isn't about having everything, but about enduring what's left and appreciating what still exists. Every now and then, I'd bump into him by chance, sometimes on the street, sometimes in a market. The conversations were short, polite, and always ended with that silence that only exists between people who've already said everything without needing to speak. He seemed like a different man, more restrained, lighter, as if he'd finally made peace with the past. and I no longer felt the same discomfort I'd felt before. It was a discreet, almost natural coexistence, but deep inside, there was a strange sense of complicity, as if each recognized in the other the scar that time hadn't erased. Over time, I realized he'd gotten involved in volunteer work. He helped at-risk youth, boys who reminded him so much of himself when he was young, lost, afraid to feel, with no sense of who they might be. One day he told me with a certain pride, maybe if someone had listened to me back then, my story would have been different. I remained silent, just nodding. There was no need to say anything. His gesture said it all. He was finally trying to break the cycle. That attitude made me think, life has this curious way of throwing the same situations back at you, only in a new form to see if you've learned to react differently. And there he was, the man who spent his entire life trying to hide who he was, now helping others not hide. It made me feel a mixture of pride and peace, because in the end, perhaps our encounter, however turbulent it may have been, had served a purpose greater than ourselves. One day he called me and invited me to an event. He said it wasn't anything big, just a conversation circle he organized once a month with some guys. I went, and when I arrived, I noticed something that struck me deeply. The room was full of men, young, old, all there to talk about things they'd never dared to, about fear, about guilt, about the weight of being who they are in a world that always demands you pretend to be someone else. He introduced me with a smile, saying, "This is an old friend." And for the first time, that word, friend, didn't hurt. During the conversation, I heard stories that felt like fragments of my own life. Men who spent decades hiding feelings, married to women they never loved, running from themselves for fear of judgment. And listening to it all, I understood how cruel silence can be, how the fear of being who you are is more destructive than prejudice itself. After that day, I started attending the group, not to talk about myself, but to listen. And it was there, listening to other men vent, that I realized that our story, however personal, represented the dilemma of an entire generation. A generation that grew up without learning to allow itself to feel, that confused strength with repression and pride with isolation. One of these encounters had a profound impact on me. A young man with a tired face and trembling hands said something that stuck with me for days. "I just wanted to grow old in peace without having to hide anything." That sentence shattered me, because it was exactly what I had longed for my entire life. And in that moment, I realized that what I had experienced had not been in vain. Because if my story served to help someone understand that it is possible to start over, then it had already served its purpose. After the meeting, we went out for coffee. He looked at me and said, "You know, I thought that as I got older, I would lose the meaning of life. But now I see that there's still time to do good." I replied, "Yes, there is time. There's always time to get things right, even when we make mistakes in the most human way possible." Time passed, and these encounters became part of my routine. And the more I spent time with those people, the more I understood something that should be obvious, but that almost no one realizes. Loneliness is the price you pay for living inside a lie. When you decide to be who you are, the world may turn its back on you, but the weight lifts. And when the weight lifts, there's room to breathe and to truly live. One rainy afternoon, I received a note from him. Not a long letter, nor a heartfelt text, just a sheet of paper with a handwritten sentence. "I think I finally understand what freedom is." That brought a sincere smile to my face, because it summed up everything we'd been through. It wasn't about romance nor about regret. It was about freeing ourselves from guilt, about looking in the mirror and recognizing ourselves without looking away. That same day, I decided to organize my things. I rummaged through old boxes, finding photos, mementos, and small objects I'd kept without knowing why. And among them, I found an old photograph. The two of us at a family lunch, laughing about something I can't even remember. For a moment I stood there staring at that image, and I realized that even without happy endings, some stories still manage to leave a beautiful trail. I spent the night thinking about this, about how life is made up of versions of ourselves, the man I was, the one I tried to be, the one I'm still trying to understand. And through it all, there's an invisible thread that connects every choice, every mistake, every forgiveness. And maybe that's what keeps us going. After a while, he began visiting me frequently, without ceremony, without explanation, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to be silent. And in those silences, there was something comforting. It wasn't about passion anymore, nor about guilt. It was about presence, about knowing someone understands the part of you the world never wanted to see. One of those days, he arrived carrying a bottle of wine and said, "Today marks exactly 30 years since that first family dinner." I laughed, somewhat in disbelief. "Do you still count time?" He replied, "Not anymore. But there are dates the body remembers, even when the mind tries to forget." And we toasted, not to the past, but to the fact that we're still here, alive, lucid, and brave enough to acknowledge our own mistakes without shame. The evening was light, filled with old stories and heartfelt laughter. We talked about politics, music, how the world has changed. And midway through the conversation, I realized that the fear had truly been left behind. There was no longer the tension of before, nor the weight of secrets. It was like talking to an old friend who's known you for so long there's nothing left to hide. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "You know what scares me the most?" I asked him what. Realizing that my whole life I've worried about what others would think, and in the end, they were never thinking about me. That made me laugh, but also reflect. It's true, we spend so much time trying to fit into other people as expectations that we forget to live for ourselves. If you got this far, comment the word "truths" below. Because that's what this video is about. The truths we hide, the ones that hurt, and most importantly, the ones that liberate. And leave a like so I know you understood the message, that this story made you think about time, about choices, about what really matters when the noise of life begins to fade away. Time has a curious way of testing us. It lifts the weight of emotions, but leaves the consequences. After everything that happened, I began to see life differently. It wasn't about love, guilt, or the past anymore. It was about looking back and understanding what truly stood after the storm. Over time, the body ages, but it's the mind that decides whether you'll grow old in peace or remain trapped in old stories. And that's what I had to learn the hard way. After that reunion, our time together became more frequent, but without that tense or secretive atmosphere. He'd come sometimes to chat, sometimes just to share the silence. We talked about everything: our routine, our old age, our children who were now moving on with their own lives, our grandchildren who came to visit occasionally and seemed to belong to another world, freer, more direct. It was strange to realize how generations have changed. What was taboo for us was bar talk for them, and this difference, while comforting, also made me think of everything we lost trying to hide our feelings. One day, he showed up unannounced, as he always did. He brought a bottle of cheap wine and a weary look. He sat in the armchair and remained quiet for a while, watching the wall clock stubbornly tick away. I asked if everything was okay. He shrugged and said, "I'm old, and old people start to overthink." That simple phrase stuck in my head, because that's how it is. There comes a point in life when we start going over our mistakes like someone reviewing an inventory. What I did right, what I did wrong, what there's still time to fix. He started talking about work, retirement, and the aches and pains that wouldn't go away. But the topic soon got deeper. He said he'd been thinking a lot about regrets. We get older and discover that it's not the wrong decisions that weigh most heavily, but the ones we didn't have the courage to make. I just nodded, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. The conversation took a different tone. We talked about growing old alone, about friendships that are lost, the silences that grow within the home. He said that sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling trapped within his own story. That, even after so many years, he still dreamed of the past. I listened to him in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned that, for those who've lived long enough, silence is worth more than any advice. In the days that followed, I began to think about how men of our generation were taught to deal with time, always silent, always hardened, always pretending nothing affects us. We learn early to hide pain, weakness, fear, and grow up believing that feeling is a sign of weakness. And that's why so many end up like us, carrying a lifetime of unspoken feelings, trying to reconcile themselves with the mirror before it's too late. He started visiting me more often, sometimes to help fix something around the house, sometimes just to have coffee and talk about politics, soccer, the price of things. These were ordinary conversations, but they brought a kind of comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. Because deep down we don't seek grand emotions in old age. We seek presence. Someone who understands the rhythm of pauses, who knows the difference between staying and filling. One afternoon, while we were cleaning the yard, he stopped and stared at the ground, thoughtful. "You know what scares me," he said. "Dying and feeling like nothing I've ever experienced made sense." I looked at him and replied, "But it did. Maybe not in the way you imagined, but it did. Every choice, even the wrong ones, brought you here. And look, we're still alive, talking, trying to make sense of what's left. That's a lot." He laughed, a short, almost incredulous laugh. "You always had this habit of making sense of things." And in a way he was right, because time has taught me that if we don't find meaning in our own pain, it ends up swallowing us up. And no man deserves to die carrying guilt that no longer serves any purpose. One day he arrived with an envelope. He said he'd been organizing papers and memories and wanted to show me something. Inside were some old photos of him, my sister, and the children, still young. And in the middle, a photo of us, taken at a family barbecue, laughing about something I can't even remember. He looked at the image and said, "We seemed happy, didn't we?" I replied, "We were, even with everything we went." We stared at that photo for a while, and I realized that, in that moment, what existed wasn't longing or regret. It was recognition. The acceptance that not everything needs to be forgotten to be overcome. After that day, he began to open up more. He spoke of his children with pride, his grandchildren with tenderness, and even laughed at his own stumbles. It was beautiful to see. The man who spent half his life trying to prove he was strong now admitted that true strength has always been about admitting weakness. "It took me 60 years to understand that," he once said. "But there's still time, right?" I replied. "As long as we breathe, we can." Over time, I noticed he was quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes he'd stare into the distance, as if trying to remember something he never experienced. One day I asked him what was going on. He replied, "I'm thinking about what comes next." "After what?" I asked. "After us. What will remain when we're no longer here?" I understood. Old age brings this urge to leave something behind. Not a possession, not a name, but an example. And perhaps without realizing it, that's what he was doing. Life at that point had become a collection of small routines that together gave meaning. The mornings with fresh coffee, the slow walks, the long conversations about nothing. There was no longer the rush of youth, nor the desperation to prove something to someone. There was only the desire to live what was left with dignity. One afternoon, he asked me to accompany him to the cemetery. He said it had been a while since he'd been there. We walked together in silence. We walked among the graves, and he stopped before my sister's name. He was silent for a long time, then said, "I wronged her so much, but somehow I think she would understand." I didn't answer. I just put my hand on his shoulder. Because there are pains that don't need words, just presence. Upon returning, he seemed lighter, like someone finally closing a cycle. And I realized, watching that aging man, that sometimes life is exactly this: closing without erasing, accepting without forgetting. Because forgiveness, when it's true, doesn't change the past. It changes how you look at it. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And if it did, I want to ask you for something simple, but it makes all the difference. Leave your like now. This shows YouTube that this type of content still matters, that real stories still have space. And if you are not yet registered, subscribe to the channel right now. Here every week, I tell stories about life, time, mistakes, forgiveness, and what truly remains when it all passes. Stories told with soul, truth, and the courage of those who have lived too long to pretend they don't feel. Oh, and so I know who really stayed until the end. Comment below the word time. I want to see who stayed until the last second of this story, and it doesn't come out yet. The next video that is appearing here on the screen continues this conversation. Click and watch now because it will make you think about what it really means, live with truth.